Hello, everyone. This week we're going to be continuing our discussion about academic argument. Last week we started looking at a few of the elements, and this week we're going to talk a little bit more about additional analysis and kind of how this will look when you write your own arguments. Okay, so as we've discussed, all academic arguments have to center on a debatable point. When we talk about argument, we're talking specifically here about academic argument, that is taking up a position on a subject and defending it. Not the same as having a debate, but it's very similar. Without a point to debate, we're not making any sort of case, and this would be more of an explanation rather than a debate. If you need to look at tests of an argument subject, I recommend that you take a look at your Little Brown Handbook text on page 211. It's got a really nice checklist as to what makes a good and a bad argument, so that's a possible check for you if you need that. So when we're talking about what makes an academic argument, we have to consider this overarching purpose. The ultimate purpose is to convince your audience. Therefore, the language that we use, if you think about what you need to use to persuade somebody, it needs to focus on what it takes to persuade your reader to consider your cause. So we're not just saying something because we feel the need to say it. We need to actually be considering this relationship with our audience, this relationship of persuasion. And your text gives each of these potential purposes a specific name, and then I've got a few of them labeled here. For example, your text states that if your argument focuses on indicating a problem or issue, it gets to be called a claim of fact, something that's indicating a problem or an issue. If it indicates a problem and a solution, it's going to be called a claim of policy. And if it's talking about, commonly held values, something that we believe in, then it's called a claim of value. The terminology doesn't matter as much as understanding what it is that your essay is trying to get you to do. Of course, when you're reading an essay, it's good to realize that's what the essay is about. The writer of the essay, is trying to get you as a reader to do something. And this understanding this helps you to make a conscious decision about the essay, and it also helps you to kind of realize what the essay is trying to get you to do, and therefore what you should be thinking about when you're creating your own writing. So you generally see these kinds of claims presented in a thesis statement, and I hope everybody remembers that a thesis statement represents the central focus of any essay, and also a roadmap of how the essay is going to discuss whatever they see as their overarching purpose. Every thesis statement is going to focus on one of these broad categories, and as a writer, you have to choose which kind of claim will best convince your audience. And that's completely a subjective decision. Usually you can take any stance on any problem. So I just want to kind of make this as a broad category discussion. So as we're talking about what can and can't be debated as far as academic argument, we do need to realize what cannot be debated and should not be the thesis claim of an argument. So these three items, physical laws or facts, beliefs, and prejudices, cannot be the thesis claim in an academic argument. A physical law or fact just simply cannot be debated. It's either true or it's not true. I can't debate the gravity on Earth as a factor. It either is or it is not. The validity of such laws can be proven, and really when you're talking about debates, nobody's going to want to debate this unless they've got new information. Physical laws and facts can be used as supporting evidence or a supporting claim, but they cannot be a thesis claim. If you're going to make those a thesis claim, then this isn't an argument anymore. This is just a description. We do this kind of physical law or fact could be a thesis claim if you were just going to have kind of an expository essay and just kind of like a book report sort of thing. I also, in addition to physical laws or facts, I also cannot debate beliefs. By beliefs, when we're talking about academic argument, we mean something that's based on faith that cannot be proved. We see this in terms of religious faith, but we also see this in terms of preferences. It's fine to have beliefs like this, but they cannot be proved by a fact. Beliefs have a role in argument, and we're going to talk a little bit more about these later, but they cannot serve as a central or thesis claim. And aside from physical laws or facts, aside from beliefs, prejudices also cannot be debated. And a prejudice, if you recall from your text, is not based on sufficient evidence, or it's based on evidence that's not closely analyzed. So, and we can kind of see this if we're looking at the roots of the word. Prejudgment is very similar to this. So a prejudice can be definitively proved one way or another. A prejudice might be something like, all people from Colorado are excellent skiers. All you would have to do is find one person who does not ski, and you've disproven this claim. And these kinds of statements are based on kind of broad generalizations like that. All, none, some. Prejudices have no place in an argument, not only as a thesis claim, but no place anywhere. So, I know that most people have them. It's kind of a human condition. We have these prejudgments that we make, but they cannot be placed in an argument. All right, so that's what cannot be debated. Let's talk a little bit more about what can be debated. Usually an academic argument focuses on an opinion and tries to convince the reader that this opinion is correct. And if you recall from your Little Brown Handbook text, an opinion is a judgment based on facts. An arguable it is arguable based on these facts. The opinion is usually an interpretation of facts. So what you're going to do is present the facts as you see them, and present how these facts connect with your assumptions, with your underlying beliefs. And an academic argument tries to convince the reader on the strength of its logic. Therefore, the logic used in the argument needs to strongly show connections between the opinions, the facts, and the beliefs. It's kind of the backbone of any good argument. Without this, if you can't show the logic, the logical connections, the logical assumptions, no writer would ever be able to convince a reader of their argument's validity. Okay, so that kind of sounds a little bit broad, and I know that's kind of on the theoretical basis. So we're going to try to hone this down a little bit and talk a little bit more about how these things connect. And there's a couple of types of reasoning that we use. Logic is a very important part of this, and I'll take a moment to put a plug in for taking a logic class. If you have an opportunity to do this, you're looking for an elective, try a philosophy class in logic. It's really amazing as to how it will help your thinking. But the two types of reasoning and logic that we're going to talk about today are deductive and inductive. These are the primary kinds of reasoning. These are how we construct an argument. And I'll kind of explain the differences between these. These are just the ways to show how the facts and the opinions and the beliefs all fit together. Okay, so it's not as academic or as difficult as it sounds. So deductive and inductive reasoning, most of the time we don't have the luxury of knowing what logic is entirely deductive or entirely inductive. It's something that makes use of both of these components. We don't usually say this is sheerly a deductive reasoning piece and this is sheerly inductive. And I hope you'll see a little bit more about how this works as we get down into some examples. Deductive reasoning is often used in expository writing. It kind of explains direct relationships, but it can be used to identify a problem as well. Inductive writing is often used in argument, but it can be used to explain relationships between claims. You have a choice, and I think as we get into it, you'll start to understand how this looks. Okay, so So, deductive reasoning is sometimes called top-down logic. It begins with a kind of a rule, and then it explains this overarching rule in terms of a couple of ideas about the overarching rule, and then applies it to a specific example or specific situation in this case. So if the example really does fit and all the statements are true, then the reasoning is good. In this example, we have cats are mammals. Mammals are warm-blooded, therefore my cat is warm-blooded. Okay? So if each of the the first two reasons are correct, then the bottom conclusion will be correct. And you can usually see conclusions identified with that therefore or something, so some sort of language like that. So if all of the top two statements are true, the bottom statement is true, the conclusion. However, deductive reasoning can often go wrong if the statements aren't necessarily working together. So, for example, this is a faulty deductive reasoning. We have mammals are cats. Cats are warm-blooded, therefore mammals are warm-blooded. It's applying a big rule to a small situation and then back to a big situation. Though cats are warm-blooded and mammals are warm-blooded as well, all mammals are not cats. So though all of these steps are correct, the reasoning is incorrect. You see, if you can tell that there's a little bit of a break in between the reasoning and those individual statements. So this would not make a good argument, despite the fact that both the second statement and the conclusion are true. It's the group of statements that doesn't work. All right. We can actually get some funny examples from this as well. This is kind of a famous humor passage for faulty deductive reasoning. God is love, love is blind, Ray Charles is blind, therefore Ray Charles is God. This is the kind of faulty deductive reasoning that you can see when it interplays different kinds of applications, like God is love, love is blind. Both of these are talking about ideal situations, and love is blind is not physical blindness. We're not referring to that directly, and therefore, the conclusion obviously comes across as a little bit silly, though some people may definitely think that Ray Charles is a fantastic artist. They're not so sure about whether or not Ray Charles is God. So, classic example of deductive reasoning gone wrong. Okay, so as we're considering it, none of those previous statements would really be an argument in terms of whether or not anybody would actually argue any of those things. But if I alter my statements just a little bit, I can make this deductive reasoning an argument. Whether or not, here we've got cats are the most popular pet to own, pet owning is the most popular hobby, therefore cat owning is the most popular hobby. If all of these statements are true, and without substantiation, without evidence, we can't prove any of these things. Whether or not that conclusion is true would depend on whether or not the previous statements are true. So if I could prove those, then I could prove the conclusion. Okay? So that's a little bit about deductive reasoning. We're going to go on and talk about inductive reasoning. This is sometimes thought of as bottom-up logic. So it's based on an example or an observation, okay, instead of starting with that law, that overarching law. So this is going to be an individual example, and then we're going to compare it to wider experience. In this case, we've got my cat exhibits antisocial behavior. Some other cats exhibit antisocial behavior. Some cats who behave antisocially claw their owners, therefore my cat might claw me. This might be a reasonable conclusion to make. Now that might is really important because we can't say for certain that this will be true, and that's one of the big differences between inductive reasoning. There's no law about cats clawing people based on antisocial behavior. It depends on very specific circumstances. Now, whether or not I can prove that those circumstances are in place with my cat will depend on whether or not that conclusion will be true. So, you may have guessed, but inductive reasoning is the kind of reasoning that we most have when we're talking about arguments. We don't often debate things that are on such law basis or such strong basis as we have with deductive reasoning, but it does happen. However, when you're doing inductive reasoning, it's important to make sure that you're not making leaps that are not appropriate. So for example, a faulty inductive reasoning might be something like this. I have a cat. Some cats exhibit antisocial behavior. Some cats who exhibit antisocial behavior might claw their owners. My cat might claw me. This is making something of a leap. If we notice between I have a cat and some cats exhibit antisocial behavior, there's a rather big leap. Just because I have a cat doesn't mean my cat's going to be antisocial. So this is the kind of thing that you often see during political years as an argument. Unfortunately, it tends to be a faulty argument. If this, then this. It can be funny when the comparisons are not accurate. And I've also included a link here on a famous faulty inductive logic with a sketch from Monty Python. I hope you guys will take a chance, take some time to look at it. It's actually not uncommon for this kind of logic, quote unquote logic, to get used. So the point when you're doing it on an inductive logic argument is that the more evidence you build up that connect these points, the more convincing you're going to be. It doesn't matter to me whether or not you remember any of these terms. Instead, it matters how you can see, if you can see how the claims and the evidence and the beliefs all come together to create a whole argument that's a whole picture. The more specific, the better. For example, this might actually be a stronger argument if I could prove that 98% of cats exhibit antisocial behavior instead of some. That using that general sum actually makes the case rather indistinct. If I said 2 out of 100 antisocial cats, then that might be also a different argument about how many cats might claw their owners if it were 70 out of 100. So the more evidence you can deliver to your reader, the better your argument's going to be and the stronger your argument's going to be as to whether or not you can make your case. So I hope that helps clear up inductive and deductive reasoning just a little bit. We're going to move on. If not, please, I hope you will let me know. We're going to move on to talking about elements of an academic argument, how all this comes together in the actual paragraphs you will construct to create your argument. Okay? So as we were talking about before, the reasoning behind the argument is really important. It forms the backbone of any good argument, and we need to talk about how that's going to look. 3 main evidence in an academic argument: claims, evidence, and assumptions. We kind of talked about those briefly, but I want to go into a little bit more detail here. We can begin to understand when we're doing analysis about an argument by observing those opinions, the facts, the assumptions that a given writer makes to demonstrate the relationships between these items. And if we remember, the claim is the statement that needs to be proved. And every argument is going to have a central claim, which is the thesis, and minor claims that are usually topic sentences. These claims are all proved by the evidence. The evidence is the facts, the statistics, the expert opinions, all of those sorts of things that make that claim true. And by looking at the relationships between the claims and the evidence, we can learn more about the writer's underlying assumptions. And I will talk more about these in detail. So, for example, let's just make a claim based on our previous examples. This is the inductive argument we were talking about before. We can decide we want to pose this kind of behavior as a problem that needs to be addressed. And if we remember, this is kind of the problem-solution idea. We would be calling our readers' attention to the problem and therefore possibly inspiring them to help find a solution. Our central claim would indicate the problem, and then the evidence we would need to do would show research determining that it is in fact a problem. Okay, so part of our evidence could be what constitutes antisocial behavior. We could provide some statistics about the number of cats that exhibit antisocial behavior. how frequent this behavior, the amount of time this behavior has been studied. We could also do some expert opinions about this, some animal behaviorists. We could talk about this information. Our central claim would be to indicate the problem, and all of this would demonstrate that it actually is a problem. Okay? And by considering these claims and the evidence, we could also start to understand some assumptions about, the writer. We could be finding out if this is a historic problem. We could find out that antisocial behavior in cats is not a temporary phenomenon. It's not something that's, been caused by our modern conditions. It's not a localized phenomenon specific to a region or a house or an owner. We could assume that antisocial behavior in cats can be corrected by human efforts. This might be another claim that we have to prove. And not only that it can be corrected, that it should be. That would be a moral assumption that we could find underlying. And whether or not you agree with any of these assumptions, you could start to see that was something that the specific writer of this paper was assuming. Whether or not any of these are true, it is the writer's responsibility to prove their points. So I hope that makes a little bit of sense as to what this could look like, the kind of relationships between claims and evidence and assumptions. I kind of want to talk a little bit more about what the composition would look like in a paper. Let's talk about what it would look like to compose such an academic argument. So, of course, when we compose an academic argument, it's just like composing any other sort of paper. We have to have an introduction. We have to have a number of body paragraphs. We have to have a response to opposing views. This is a little bit different in academic argument than other arguments. And we have to have a conclusion. Each argument's going to differ slightly in the order of these. We have, of course, the introduction and the conclusion have to remain static, but where we put those body paragraphs in relationship to the response to opposing views is kind of different, depending on any given person. Your Little Brown Handbook makes some really great suggestions about response to opposing views. This can include if you are really concerned that you're having a very controversial subject, a lot of times people will begin right after the introduction with a response to opposing views. That can be a possible relationship. Some people order their body paragraphs in terms of strongest to weakest points or weakest to strongest points. They want to end strong. You have a lot of flexibility in terms of how you're going to organize your arguments. So these are all personal choice that you have to do. Whatever you decide to do, you have to keep in mind that ultimate purpose. What's going to help your audience understand your perspective, okay? Whatever you decide, the introduction always should give some basic background information that your audience needs to discuss and understand your perspective. This could be kind of a summary of information about who you're responding to, definition of terms. Sometimes people will include some historic information in their paragraph. And we'll talk more about this in detail, but it's why your audience needs to understand your perspective. In our deductive argument that we were talking about when we asserted that owning cats was the most popular pet, they might talk something about why they would care about this, how many people are pet owners, that sort of thing. The body paragraphs have to break apart the main idea. They have to provide evidence, and we're going to talk more about this in detail. This could be such things as providing and analyzing historic evidence, current statistics, expert opinions, other survey results, that sort of thing. And then the conclusion, you don't want to introduce any new information in your conclusion. You just kind of want to wrap up all your points. And we will talk about this more in detail when we break out each individual parts of your argument. But the conclusion should wrap up this. Sometimes people do something like exit with a question that might engage your audience more. But as I said, we'll talk about this a little bit more. Okay, the writer. All right, so let's look at this in a little bit more depth. Let's talk about, first of all, the introduction. The introduction is kind of a so what question. Why should readers care? This is kind of an opportunity for the writer to attempt to orient the reader, to get the reader on the same page. So in our cat example, an introduction might explain the value of hobbies, why, if you wanted to go from that angle. You may explain the idea of why selecting a popular pet is a good idea. You might explain your personal investment in whatever the subject is. A lot of people use a narrative introduction, kind of giving a personal twist to it. You can understand what you might be able to talk a little bit more about what constitutes popularity and why that's important. Some people wouldn't find it important, but others might. So that would be your kind of introduction moment to talk about, so what? Why should your readers care? Why should they follow you in your argument? Okay, and the body paragraphs. This is kind of your proof, your opportunity to present your evidence. These are usually going to be facts or evidence or things like authorities on hobby statistics or pet owning statistics. You might describe research on statistics over a period of time and the result of the research. You need to really kind of go into depth and talk about whatever the subject is. In this case, we're still talking about cats. So again, this is our deductive argument. You may talk about opposing viewpoints, and you always do need to address opposing viewpoints. You can, in this case, you might talk about the validity of other statistics, offer concession, such as dog ownership or other hobbies, such as gardening. You might talk about the history of hobbies and statistics. Maybe this is a dynamic sort of thing. But you always have to talk about what the quote-unquote other side would think about this idea. Your job is to demonstrate, when you talk about responding to opposing viewpoints, that whatever this argument is it's a complex issue. So it's important to talk about other perspectives as well. So, and sometimes I do get asked about this. Response to opposing viewpoints, you always have to have something there. You don't have to agree with the other viewpoints, but you do have to address them in some fashion. Okay, and then in your conclusion, you could possibly talk about, once again, it's kind of repetitive, but why considering a popular pet might be something to consider if you're choosing a pet or if you wanted to choose a hobby. Why choosing a cat would be a good idea. Sometimes people, again, will, particularly with something like this where it's a personal investment, they'll conclude with something of a narrative conclusion. Sometimes they'll conclude with a question. Something to engage the reader, again, a so what thing. This is your opportunity to give kind of the final takeaway that you want your reader to have when you're constructing your argument. Okay, so those are just a little very brief discussions, but something to start thinking about, because those are kind of more research questions. At this phase of your writing careers, we're going to be responding to texts, and specifically, this often happens in English classes or other classes where you're looking at a source and you need to respond to that. We're responding to someone else's text, and if you've taken a look at essay number 2, you'll understand that we're going to be making an argument regarding somebody's text. Okay, so for example, if we were going to make a text-based argument about an essay that we've read, Student Loans by Thomas Sowell, it's on pages, I think it's 148 to 149, in your Little Brown Handbook. For essay 2, you will be considering somebody else's argument and your response to that. So you're going to have to break down the individual's claims, the evidence, the assumptions. So I'm going to do an example here of how we might discuss this particular essay. So we have to pull out, this is where we're going to start pulling out claims, and these are the kinds of things we've been talking about this semester, how to pull out a claim, how to look at what somebody's talking about in a specific essay. So in this particular essay in Student Loans, we're going to pull out one claim that he makes. To politicians, it follows as the night follows the day that the government should come to college students' rescue with the taxpayers' money. And I bracketed college students since it said they in this case. And this was from Sowell, page 148. This is one claim that makes Sal makes early in his essay and a claim that seems to be consistently important in his thinking. So it seems to me that this would be a valid claim to discuss if we were going to write an argument essay about this particular essay, about Sal's initial essay. So the evidence that he uses here, there's a couple of claims that we've got. Before 1978, he offers this: college loans were available through government programs only to students whose family income was below some cutoff level. But in an era of compassion, Congress took off even those previous income limits. So this is one of the evidence moments that he makes to show that the government is coming to the taxpayers' rescue, quote unquote. Numerous, and in addition, he also says numerous government subsidies and loan programs make it possible for many people to use vast amounts of society's resource at low cost to themselves. Again, this is a government helping out the people who are wanting to go to college. So this is his backup for that. First of all, as we attempt to analyze this, we need to determine if these claims and if the evidence are true. And this would be something that we would definitely want to go back and do some research on. However, we're going to, just for the sake of this argument, say that these are true. We're going to make this assumption that these are true in order to examine some of the underlying assumptions that Sal is making. So this is a couple of assumptions that I've pulled out. First of all, he's assuming that these programs are vast. He's assuming that the lack of limits on these loans is significant enough to cause severe deleterious effects on the national budget. Okay, so he seems to be making an assumption that these are bad things. And he's assuming that every person who can qualify for these programs, they make use of them. He's also assuming that taxpayers get little or no benefit from an educated population outside of financial interests returned on school loans. And because he's an economist, he's of course focusing on the financial end of it. But unfortunately, because he's not giving us a lot of hard data, without doing a lot of research, what we need to do is kind of stick with talking about the relationship between his logic and the assumptions and the evidence. He makes these, without hard data, it's really difficult to determine the exact correctness of his assumptions and the exact correctness of his data. We don't actually have the hard data here. So because this essay, our initial essay, is going to focus on not a lot of research, though if you wanted to do a bit of outside research to kind of look at statistics, that would be fine. But we have to kind of hone in on something that's happening inside the context of the essay in order to make an argument for our essay number 2. So this is a claim that I found to respond to his underlying assumption. Now, of course, you can discuss other items from this. You can discuss the evidence, you can discuss the logic, but I'm choosing to address his underlying assumptions. So in his essay, Student Loans, Thomas Sowell fails to acknowledge the non-monetary value taxpayers have to gain from having an educated public. And then I would go on to discuss this. This could be a thesis claim. We don't agree that the underlying concept that taxpayers gain nothing from having an educated population, that educated people have something to add to society. This is a possible thesis that we could address his argument with. So when we would go back, we could construct an argument that Student Loans is an essay written by Thomas Sowell, and give some discussion of the background essay about his concerns. Our body paragraphs could talk about the ways that Sowell references groups of individuals without thinking about what this does for the whole society, and whether all gains for education could be suggested in purely political and economic terms. This is a possibility. We could break down we could bring up some research of our own about what education does in terms of positive additions to society, such as, volunteer hours or lack of time spent in jail, or anything like that. We could use those as body paragraphs. The opposing viewpoint might speak to the idea that SAL does have some valid concerns about the motivations of politicians, as well as the concern for overspending. But we could also then come around and say that these concerns are limited and they don't look at the entire picture. That would be a fair thing to say. And then conclude, we could possibly bring up a suggestion that more research needs to be done about the problem that SAL describes and how that might fit into something more of a holistic approach, that what SAL is talking about is only a piece of the puzzle. So that's one possible idea for an argument response, just something kind of quick. Most of the time, we can usually find one or two things that we agree with on any given argument and one or two things that we disagree with. We don't have to either completely disagree or agree with anything that we read. But both of these ways I could completely construct an argument in which I totally agree that economic concerns were the primary way to look at student loans. I could completely disagree with Thomas Sowell's point. I have a lot of room. This is where your own personal perspective, your own personal voice can come in. All of these are valid ways to talk about this subject. So I hope that this gives you a bit of direction on how argument essays are constructed and analyzed, and gives you thoughts about how to proceed for Essay 2. I really recommend that you look over Essay 2 as included in this week's assignment lineup. Start thinking about ideas. You can start talking about ideas with either your peers or with me if you have concerns. This might be a really good idea to make notes on this subject. The essay essay number 2 is going to be due on March 15th. We do have some time, but preparation, including thinking about it in advance, may help you compose a stronger argument. So, once again, I hope that it helps clear up some points on academic argument, but as always, please let me know if there are any questions that I can answer. Thanks so much, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all on the discussion boards.